the Wisconsin Magazine for January 22nd. Reporting from Madison, Dave Iverson.
Good evening. Welcome to this week's magazine. We'll take you dog sled racing in about 10 minutes or so. But this week we also have on tap an update on some familiar scenes. Pictures like the ones you are about to see were a frequent sight on television newscasts last summer. Cuban refugees waiting for homes, passing time at Fort McCoy. Many of those new arrivals were kids, and some of those teenagers were completely on their own, without parents or family. For them, the wait was often the longest. Tonight, we'll visit with one of those teenagers and a Milwaukee family who formed a new home. Then later in the half hour, part 2 of Art Hackett's story on energy alternatives. Last week, it was solar satellites. Tonight, we'll be taking a look at wind power. Coming home, the news of the week and the year. Our feature story tonight is about the themes of cultural difference in coming home, but for Cuban refugees, not returning Americans. We hope both stories will have the same ending. Last year, thousands of Cuban refugees came to this country, leaving behind everything they owned or knew. When the appeal was made to help sponsor Cuban refugees in Wisconsin, there was also a special need to find homes for unaccompanied teenagers, kids on their own. We wondered what had happened to those children, if they'd found homes, and where. It turns out that most of those kids have been placed, the majority in Milwaukee foster homes. Carol Larson visited one of those homes recently and reports that the placement process is working well.
Yeah.
Bajo? Short.
Short.
Okay.
During his English lesson, 17-year-old Joaquin may cheat a little bit on the language flashcards, but when he came to America, he didn't know he'd have to learn another language. He assumed that everyone here spoke the same as he did, in Spanish.
Sia.
Sure.
Chair.
The tutor is Laura Hansen, a Marquette language student, and while Joaquin concentrated on her English instructions, his foster mother, Camille Shaw, concentrates on the Spanish. She too is learning a different language in order to help Joaquin adjust to America and the family.
Camille and I had been talking, I guess, about getting a foster children or adoptive children additional to the two that we have had foster children and adopted children in the past. Both of us just got immediately very excited about, having someone from a different culture living with our children. We thought it'd be a real learning experience for us and for the child, whoever we got to come in. And that's how we started.
He can't talk to you.
Oh, he can.
He can.
I think that something Joe noticed, maybe about the third day that he was here, people talk with their face, they talk with their eyes, they talk with their hands, they talk with their body. And in a sense, we felt like we established immediately, at least on our part, a real trust of him, because we felt like he couldn't hide anything, because he couldn't hide behind language. And I think sometimes, with words we try and hide what we're really feeling. And, he couldn't do that.
I, at least personally, have been pleasantly surprised. The placements have not presented as many difficulties as we might have anticipated.
Lamar Cosby is the executive director of the Children's Service Society in Milwaukee and responsible for placing 35 of the Cuban children. Almost all have been placed, mostly with families who do not speak Spanish, and again in a land they knew little about.
These youngsters came to this country, like many of the Cubans came to this country, with the expectation that the streets were paved with gold, and it was a land of immediate opportunity. And they're confronted with the fact that sure, it's a land of opportunity, but there's some things you have to have in order to make that opportunity become a reality. One of them is the ability to speak English.
Do you have any problems not knowing the language?
¿Hablar inglés? Un poco. No mucho.
Not a lot, a little.
After a month and a half with the family, Joaquin is starting to recognize some English, and the Shaws are starting to recognize some Spanish. Plus, there are tutors and a bilingual counselor from the Children's Service Society. All describe Joaquin as the silent type, though he quickly became comfortable with the Shaws and their 4 children.
Son iguales.
Son iguales. He says that this family is very much like his family in Cuba. 6 sisters and 4 brothers. He hasn't seen his family in 2 years and 8 months.
Very early on, Joaquin admitted to the Shaws that he was one of the Cubans that came from the prisons.
He came here hoping that he would, that could start a new life here, and that he'd like to go back and visit Cuba in 5 years to see his family and his mother. Hoping that he would.
Like other Cuban children, Joaquin does not like to talk much about Cuba or what happened on the way here. He is now more concerned with getting used to America and the unexpected things about Wisconsin.
Porque en Cuba no hay nieve,
No snow in Cuba.
no hace frío.
Not this cold.
Y aquí cuando yo llegué, contica muero del frío casi.
He thought he was going to die of coldness when he got here.
What about the differences in going back to school?
Aquí doy yo clase.
Cuba, there's one teacher for 8 classes, and he's 1 hour of English, and it's hard to learn in that hour.
As for food, Joaquin does not think much of American taste buds.
El café.
Coffee? ¿Cómo es diferente?
El café aquí parece agua.
It's very weak. It's like water. For example, in Cuba, if you were making coffee 3 blocks from here in a house, you could smell it here. The Cuban food is better than any food in Mexico, Puerto Rico, anywhere.
I don't know if he realizes, but we have done a lot of changing in our eating habits. And part of that is because we're pretty flexible. And we've eaten an awful lot of rice and beans in the last month and a half. Also, I think that he's been very willing to make compromises, some of which have probably, I think, been very difficult for him. And we just really appreciate that he's been willing to do that.
Those compromise being?
Well, I think one of the things is, you know, Mother here does not do all the work. Obviously, everyone would like that, you know, including Joe, but it doesn't work that way. And at first, he, of course, was quite scandalized that, you know, I do cook supper, but lunch and breakfast are pretty much, you know, get your own and I'll help, depending on how old you are. And we talked to him about that with the social worker, and so at that point, he chose to be hungry rather than do anything about it. But, you know, it was really within hours that he was pitching in and really, I guess, trying to be part of the family, if that's how this crazy family does things.
Well, I think there's several reasons why it's worked out for us and for the youngsters and for the foster parents. I think one is the youngsters came to this country wanting something better than what they had, which gives them a level of motivation. The second thing is, I think the foster parents, we've been very fortunate in the selection process and that we've got a good group of people that we're working with.
When things don't go the way you expect them, you tend to want to blame the child. And it's really quite an adjustment. I think part of it is you have to adjust as a family, just the same as a child is adjusting to your family. You have to learn new rules. Living together is quite difficult.
Joaquin's new guitar was a Christmas present from the Shaws after they found out he used to play when he was little.
I think it's important that you be flexible. I think also it's important that you be a warm person. The first week, I thought if you can die from homesickness, he would have. But that's been getting a lot better, and when he does get depressed, it's not as deep and it's not as long. So he's evidently learning ways to, you know, cope with it.
Is there anything you'd like to say to the Americans?
Que los cubanos
Thinks that the families should open their doors to Cubans, and that a lot of the Cubans, what they need are
padres.
parents.
There are, by the way, several Cuban youngsters living in group homes awaiting placement with foster families. So if you would like to open a few of those doors and are interested in becoming a foster parent, you can contact the Children's Service Society in Milwaukee or Catholic Social Services in Madison.